Hello and welcome to the From A to Z Azure Virtual Conference. This session is on getting started with the Cloud Adoption Framework. My name is Dwayne Natwick. I'm a Microsoft Azure MVP and a Microsoft Certified Trainer. I'm also a regional lead for the Microsoft Certified Training Program. I hold multiple Azure and Microsoft 365 role-based certifications, and you can follow me on the social media links provided on this slide. So what are we going to cover in this session? We're going to start off with a introduction and a background in terms of the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure and what are some of the driving factors around it and what is the background around the development of it. Then we're going to go and deep dive a little bit into what the framework is, what we do in terms of assessments and planning, and what each of the areas of the Cloud Adoption Framework are, and what make up those specific areas of the workflow. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about Cloud Adoption Framework governance and the governance model as we build our cloud native organization and adopt more and more Azure cloud workloads. How do we then govern over that infrastructure? So let's talk about what the motivation is and why we have a cloud adoption framework and what its use is. So here's some things around what we're talking about when we're talking about our motivations. What is motivating us from a migration standpoint? Are we looking to lift and shift? Are we looking to modernize? What are some of the objectives that we have? Is it infrastructure, apps, data around our assets? Is it specific application workloads? Or is it specific areas within departments or portfolios that we need to move that are our objective for cloud adoption? And then there's a list here of 20 different motivations, really, that I'm not going to go through every one of them in the time that we have today. But what are we trying to do? Are we trying to scale to meet market demands or geographies? Has there been a merger or acquisition that has required some changes in how our infrastructure is handled to serve our increased our growth in our organization? Are we trying to save in terms of costs from a CapEx to an OpEx standpoint? Are we trying to avoid the need to purchase new equipment or purchase new licensing? Those are all different things that we have as motivations to adopt cloud services. And once we think about that and we think about what our motivations are, we need to think about what our challenges also are to moving to cloud services and moving to Azure and adopting a cloud framework or just adopting cloud infrastructure. And there are two key components here that kind of work in concert to our cloud adoption, and it is culture and cost. And we need to think about our culture in two ways. Culture from a top-down approach in terms of what our high levels of management require, what they are going to require and need from a standpoint of financial stability in terms of avoiding continuous capital expenditures in IT infrastructure, or and moving that to an operational expense may be a motivating factor and a reason why we are moving to a cloud native architecture within our workloads, and why we may determine that we need to move certain workloads to the cloud and no longer have data centers as part of our our organizational footprint. And then we need to think from a bottom-up perspective. Our employees need the necessary skills to support cloud technologies, or maybe we're going to utilize a partner for that, or we need to also understand the change management of what is going to take place when we move from our particular data centers to a cloud based provider. And then from a cost perspective, we need to balance out the way that we are adapting and adopting to cloud applications. Are we looking at this from a holistic approach where we are utilizing the cloud infrastructure for its proper benefits and getting to being cloud native rather than utilizing having a sunk cost type infrastructure of on-premises and legacy applications? As we move and adopt cloud technologies and move our workloads to the cloud, we have different maturity model stages. We have and those stages are around our governance, our architecture, our operations, and our overall organization. And as we go through this maturity model, we are moving from that on-premises environment to a cloud-native environment. And the first and foremost is mirroring what we have on premises to the Azure environment, which is more of a lift and shift approach. And then we start to, as we evolve, doing more innovation and becoming more cloud native in our approach and how we're moving workloads. And this increases our maturity. This reduces our time to market for applications. We're developing now our applications for the cloud rather than for an on-premises environment. So we are reducing our time to market and enabling our business to innovate and to also take advantage of the benefits and the return on investment that we get from moving to our cloud technologies. And some of those business drivers are transforming for cloud technologies, what we're doing to modernize, transform, what we need to do to grow and to scale to meet market demands, and then the better that we modernize, transform, and grow, give us more rapid and greater business returns. From an IT perspective, we want to look at and we think about our drivers being the availability of our services, decreasing risks and vulnerabilities within our environment, having consistency for our policy and audits and security baselines, and protecting our customer data is ultimately our main goal, making sure that we aren't exposing personal identifiable information or personal health information if we're a healthcare provider. We need to protect that information. And it's then, as we take into account and think about all of those business drivers and those technical drivers, we now move into the conversation of the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework. So now we've determined that we have drivers in place from a business and a technical perspective that tells us that we are ready to adopt Azure and adopt a cloud native plan. Now, how do we get there? And we get there, and Microsoft has created the Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure as a set of documentation, tools, templates, and best practices to achieve the workflow and to help us in our journey to cloud adoption. And this journey helps. What we want to do within this journey is balance between our people, processes, and technologies, and what we're doing in terms of how we are bringing that into play in terms of what workloads we're taking to the cloud, what we're leaving on premises for now, and what those waves are going to be as we continue our adoption and our maturity to a cloud native architecture. So what is that framework, and what are the pieces of that framework, and what is that approach? And Microsoft's Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure has created this modular approach to help us on our journey as an organization to cloud adoption. And the workflow for this is on this slide, and it shows that we have that we start with a strategy and a plan. And we're going to go through each one of these in depth in this session. But first and foremost, if we don't have a strategy and a plan, where are we going? It's failure to plan is a plan to fail. So a key component and a key piece to all of this is working with all of our stakeholders from a business through a technical, through a user perspective, and building and putting a strategy together, identifying workloads and planning what workloads and what phases and what waves we're going to take those applications to Azure. And then once we have that plan in place, then we can get the environment ready, build our first landing zones for our virtual networks and for our connections for a hybrid architecture, and then we can begin to adopt. And we'll talk again more about the two motions in play for adoption, where we're talking about are we just going to migrate in a lift and shift approach, or are we going to innovate our applications as we do adopt our Azure services? And then down at the bottom is the govern and manage components. So we want to govern our resources. We want to make sure that we're maintaining proper legal and regulatory requirements, and we want to then also take that governance, and we need to manage that governance and monitor our resources and manage our costs, our security, and all of those components that we'll talk about more here in a moment. The objective of the model is twofold. So we have had that people, processes, and technologies, and what we need to do around people, processes, and technology is we want to balance between the control and stability of our organization. We don't want to obviously upset the apple cart to a point where we have lost control and we don't have stable applications within our environment, and we cause disruption within our organization. But we also want to have speed and results as well. We don't want to drag out these processes and have scope creep in the migration process, where we're potentially having applications in on-premises infrastructure and cloud infrastructure, and causing a out of control type situation in terms of cost control and things like that. So it's a delicate balance, and the utilizing the cloud adoption framework and the tools and the best practices and templates that are available to you, which I'll provide in the chat as we go through as we're going through these. You will gain knowledge and understanding through the journey that others have provided and shared with Microsoft, that give you a foundation for that speed and result. So let's talk about each component of the framework and what the framework brings, and what each of these areas of the workflow we have in terms of deliverables and motions that we have to put in play. So the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure has these 6 modules to their workflow. It starts off with define the strategy, where we need to find what is our justification, what are our outcomes, what are those motivations, like we talked about in the first few slides. What are we planning for? That strategy. Then we create the prioritization of what applications we have, and then we start to plan. We start to determine what that digital estate's going to look like, how that's going to align with our organization and the change management, what that plan is for skills and skill readiness and cloud adoption planning. I'm doing another session as part of this conference around the Cloud Center of Excellence, and we'll talk more about that. Talk about that briefly when we're talking about planning and readying and adopting and and how all of that falls in. The ready piece. Now we have made our plan. We have determined our what workloads are going to adopt, to migrate to the cloud. So we now need to determine, in terms of which phases, what our readiness is, how ready those applications are, how they're going to move to the cloud. Are they going to migrate? Are they going to innovate? And we start to build our blueprints and our best practices and our landing zones, our base policies and network architecture and what our tagging requirements are, and all of that fall into that readiness and how we're going to now start to build our infrastructure, get our infrastructure ready within the Azure environment, get it tied into our on-premises architecture so that then we can start to adopt. And when we start to adopt, now we need to determine, are we going to migrate, or are we going to just rehost? We're going to lift and shift from what we have on-premises into Azure, or are we going to innovate? Do we need to are we going to put some of these services, maybe some of these databases on platform-based services? Are we going to rewrite any of our code to make our application more cloud native and support things like Azure App Services for web apps? And those type of things. And then once we start to adopt our workloads into the cloud and into Azure, now we are governing. Now we need to govern and manage our resources. And the next slides are actually going to go a little bit deeper detail in each one of these. And you can see here we've got, in terms of our strategy, we need to document all of what our motivation is, our motivations are. Why are we moving to the cloud? That's really the why. And what is motivating us? What are we trying to accomplish in moving to the cloud? What are our business outcomes from a revenue, cost, and profit perspective, from a performance perspective? What are our business justifications from business, financial, accounting, from a technology standpoint? And then we determine what that first project's going to be. What is the workloads that are going to support moving to the cloud, and our business model and our motivations and objectives. So we're planning all of this out with not just our technical people, but with our user groups, with our HR and legal teams. We're determining, from a business perspective, what the business wants from a top-down and a bottom-up perspective in terms of, if you require, in terms of our motivations and why we want to move to Azure. Once we have defined that strategy, now we start to plan. We determine what our digital estate's going to be, what our alignment's going to be from the cloud, from a strategy standpoint. Again, we have our groups of our business, our operations, our governance, and then our success team, who is monitoring success. What are we doing in terms of cost management? What are our requirements? What is our governance minimum viable product that we're going to deliver to maintain and manage our policies and govern over our resources from a cost or a security perspective? We then need to build a skill readiness plan, determine skills are different. Technical skills required for managing an on-premises infrastructure versus a cloud infrastructure are somewhat different, and you need to have a different skill set to a degree to manage that public cloud environment? And are you going to utilize that and have one team for your cloud resources and one for your on-premises infrastructure resources, or are we going to cross-train and have that managed within our team? From both sides, you need to think about that. And then you think about your cloud adoption plan, and this is where we really get into what we're going to do in terms of migrate versus innovate. We have our 5R strategy. Are we going to rehost, refactor, re-architect, rebuild, or replace? And the time to market and time to get that ready and to adopt gets more complex as you go from rehost to replace, because you have much more development that will need to take place in terms of that re-architect, rebuild, and replace than you do with rehost and maybe even refactor. Refactoring might be just instead of utilizing a SQL server in the cloud, you're going to utilize SQL database services, Azure database, SQL database services. So then we think about our infrastructure migration. We think about our applications, what is going to be born in the cloud, or are we, again, data driven? Are we focusing on consolidating our data services and moving that way? So how are we adopting the cloud? Is it from an infrastructure perspective? Is it an application perspective, or is it a data-driven perspective? And that's going to, one way or another, also factor into what that strategy is going to be in terms of rehosting versus re-architecting or rebuilding. Once we've made that plan and we've determined what direction we're going, now we start to ready. And this is where we are going to look at our applications, each one of our applications, our databases, all of that, and determine, what the readiness is, what what applications rely on what databases, so that we can migrate that all properly to the Azure environment. And when we get to that point in terms of identifying the readiness, now we're starting to build our base infrastructure around our network design, our storage design, what our compute and data is all going to look like. We're going to determine how identity and access is going to work. And what least privilege is going to look like in terms of what resources are going to have access to what within our environment, and then determine what our cost model is, and then build our blueprints out of all of those components so that we can then continue to grow and can utilize those practices and those baselines that we have created in terms of the initial readiness. As we ready and move more applications and more workloads to Azure, we have now blueprints built in terms of what our corporate standards are going to be and our organizational requirements are going to be for workloads to move to Azure. Now we have our adopt migrate approach, which is more of a rehost. Maybe a little bit of refactoring might take place, or re-platforming, so to speak, might take place in terms of the migrate approach of adoption. But really, what we're doing is lifting and shifting. We're taking virtual machines and servers that are in our on-premises environment, and we're moving those to Azure, and we're leveraging services such as Azure Migrate and different assessment services to identify the ability for these workloads to move to the Azure environment. Once we get those into the Azure environment, we want to look at the performance and test the performance and optimize that performance. And that might be resizing virtual machines, resizing databases. And then once we have adopted, now we secure and manage, and we move into those management capabilities. We put monitoring capabilities in place for security and configuration management. The innovation piece is more of a DevOps approach, where now we're taking approaches and we're building backlogs for our applications to innovate and to be refactored, re-architected, or rebuilt within the Azure environment. So we're doing, this is driving more of a cloud native approach to our migration, to our adoption to cloud services, rather than migrates just really that lift and shift, and we're getting rid of that CapEx and that hardware that might be depreciated within our data center. We're now moving to an OpEx approach in the migrate, but in the innovate motion and workflow, we're taking on and we're adopting a DevOps approach, and we're moving further to that cloud, closer to that cloud native maturity model that we showed in the adoption maturity slide earlier in this presentation, where we are now really looking at our applications before we move them, as we ready them for cloud adoption. We are going to innovate and get out of that legacy application type of utilizing virtual machines and database servers, where we're now using platforms and serverless and containers, and we're driving more of the TCO, the total cost of ownership, of utilizing cloud service providers such as Azure. Once we've adopted, now we have to govern, and so we'll talk a little bit more about govern here in a little bit. But really, what we're looking at in terms of governance is we're reducing our business and technical risks we're building security and identity baselines. We're building compliance policies to make sure that we have standards in place and requirements in place to manage our costs and our security and our compliance, both from a legal or a regulatory standpoint. We need to govern these resources, and there are a lot of tools in place that Microsoft provides within Azure that help us with this governance and building those processes. And again, part of that governance goes into as we become more mature in cloud adoption and become more cloud native, is having a cloud center of excellence that helps to identify and document what our best practices are, what our baselines are, and continuing to modify and evolve those as we go about. That's one of the key components to building a cloud center of excellence. Then the last component that goes along with governance is managing and monitoring, building resiliency, making sure our resources are available and available when they need to be available, that everything's working properly from an operational standpoint, that everything is protected from a security standpoint, and that everything is properly audited and maintained from a policy perspective. All goes into that manage and operations approach. So now that we know our cloud adoption framework, what tools do we have available to us for that assessment and planning piece? Those first couple of areas there of defining the strategy and planning. What do we have, and how do we start, and where do we go for that? Microsoft provides some tools that we can use as an organization for assessing and for managing and tracking how we are going through our cloud adoption framework. With the Cloud Journey Tracker, we have the Azure Architecture Review capability, where we can go through and we can look at best practices. We can request a review from Microsoft as well. We can hook up with a partner to review those architectures as well, and I'll provide these links in the chat so that everybody has access to them. We can also assess our governance benchmarks and what's important to us, and set those benchmarks up as part of what our governance minimal viable product is. And then we can then also utilize Azure DevOps and build a cloud adoption plan on how and build our backlog and our tasks through Azure DevOps and utilize various strategy and plan templates that are available for our cloud adoption, and building our plan and documenting our plan and building those waves, those backlog waves and our sprints from a DevOps perspective into our cloud adoption framework. As we build our plan, we ready our environment, and then we adopt our cloud services. The last piece we're going to talk about is the cloud. Go a little bit more into the cloud governance model and what we need to do and how we need to think about our governance throughout the process. We want to keep, even though governance falls in that bottom tier of, once you've adopted Azure services and started your cloud adoption journey, you have governance, but governance should be part of that strategy and plan phase as well, because we need to know what our business risks are, what our requirements are from policy and compliance, and what we're from a process approach, how we're monitoring that going forward. And we need to plan all that up front, and that all goes into our blueprints and our landing zone build that we're going to put in place initially. And we have 5 disciplines of cloud governance. They are cost management, security baseline, resource consistency, identity baseline, and deployment acceleration. And some of these you actually will see if you go to Azure Advisor. They'll give you recommendations on how to, on ways to manage your costs, to help with security, even identity, and even like resource, from a performance and high availability standpoint, that resource consistency. So we can put all that in play, and we have a couple of slides that'll show what those resources are within the Azure environment that help us with that governance. And we should have a governance team that takes this into account and builds this as part of our organization. And as we evolve and grow, this team really falls into that cloud center of excellence and how we can continue to evolve our governance model from a minimum viable product to a fully evolved execution of our governance. And you can see, we don't want, governance and management within the cloud adoption framework is an ever evolving aspect of that workflow. It is constant. If you noticed from the workflow diagram, the arrows were going both ways. So they're circling around and around, really, ultimately within the cloud adoption framework. As you're moving more infrastructure into Azure, you may need to adjust. And as you grow geographically, you may need to adjust your governance models. And that's what really this slide is discussing. Is you want to start with the minimum viable product, the minimum requirements that you have from a standpoint of what you need to govern over, what your risks are, what your identity strategy is, your encryption and networking requirements, all of those things, your cost disciplines, where your resource disciplines, where from a geographic standpoint, your resources are going to lie. We need to protect our data. We need to understand our critical apps and where our confidential information are, as well as manage our costs. But we need to start small, just like we're starting small in terms of identifying our workloads and planning our workloads accordingly. We're going to start small with our governance as well, and it's going to continue to evolve as we bring more workloads and adopt more cloud technologies. We are going to need to evolve our governance as well. And here's some of those resources that Microsoft has that are native within the Azure environment to manage these pillars, in terms of corporate policies and the disciplines. And you can see we have blueprints and policies. Azure Advisor fall into many of these. We have Azure Security Center, or what's known now as Microsoft Defender for Cloud. We have Sentinel to help with those security baselines and the security operations piece. We have role-based access control. We have federated services. We have identity protection services, all fall and help with those identity baselines. We have privileged identity management that can help us monitor and audit the governance of our administrative privileges within Azure Active Directory. There's many tools within the Azure environment that we can utilize for maintaining and monitoring our governance. And then there are also third-party tools that Microsoft has within the marketplace and within their partners that can also help with many of these as well. And those are listed on a slide. I'm not going to go into detail there with that. But many of these are probably familiar to some of you. Terraform's a big one because it helps to build deployment templates across both Azure as well as other cloud providers to have, again, those blueprints and those those standards and for governance and policies that are part of all of your deployments. And again, we're driving governance in terms of a risk-driven evolution, identifying where our risks are, predicting where those risks are, and building our governance approach and governance requirements, our policies, our strategies, all based on, as those risks grow and those risks change, then we need to, again, evolve what our governance strategy is. And as we move and adopt more applications and workloads into the cloud, these risks are going to continue to increase. So we're going to need to, again, continue to evolve what our governance model is. And here's, again, the execution of incremental governance. Where are the risks? When are the risks being introduced? And how are we then going to evolve our plan? Again, our plan for governance should be within our plan for adoption, because we're going to, as we introduce more workloads into the cloud, we're going to have more cost governance. We're going to need more security governance, identity governance, all of those things. More application. We might not be moving mission critical applications as our first phase to cloud adoption, but as we move more business critical applications to Azure, our levels of application criticality might increase as well, and we need to have governance around resiliency and high availability built in when we move those applications to the cloud. So what are some of our next steps? And these, there are links on this slide that I'll provide in the chat for you to grab and have after you leave this session. But welcome you. It's important to understand and know how you're going to understand and plan and what you are going to do in terms of your design principles and your design guidelines to build out your environment, build your landing zones. There are reference implementation guides that you can follow and you can reference for understanding how to configure your environment. And there's a GitHub repository on enterprise landing zones that you can utilize and find some best practices that others have used and shared on GitHub for building that readiness state as you move to cloud adoption. So that brings this session to a close. So what we went through the introduction, what some of those drivers are and motivations are, and what motivated really Microsoft to create that cloud adoption framework. We talked about then the cloud adoption framework for Azure, what each of those components are, how we can then assess our environment and plan for cloud adoption, and then how we govern and what the cloud adoption framework governance model is to be able to maintain our base level policies and requirements from a business and security perspective, and maybe even a regulatory perspective within our environment. So I want to thank everybody for attending this session here today. I will stay online for the next until the top of the hour for any additional questions that you may have. I will provide all of the links within the Q&A for this session in the Q&A as announcements. So feel free to grab those links and put those links up. And utilize those links as you build your plan and plan for your cloud adoption. Thank you very much for attending, and hope you enjoy the other sessions that you attend as part of the A to Z Azure conference.